In addition to that, he's basically saying if you didn't have that kid, you could come out and get drunk with me and possibly hook up. That's not, like, what kind of message is that?
Hello and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints. It's a show where longtime friends and musicians get together to discuss a randomly selected album from Robert Dimery's book, 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. We'll give you some context on the band and the album that we're talking about this week. We'll do a bit of a deep dive on a few select tracks. And at the end, we'll vote on whether or not you must listen to this album before you die. My name's Alan. I've been playing music for just over 20 years, but I've been complaining about music for about twice as long. So take everything with a grain of salt that you hear on this here program today. But this week, I'm really excited to talk about a band who, at one point in their career, not on this album, unfortunately, but wrote a song with possibly the best song title ever, which is "What I Like Most About You Is Your Girlfriend." And that...
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, that seems like something Tom would write. But of course, we are talking about the ska revival band known as The Specials and their self-titled debut album. So we'll do some introductions shortly, but before we do that, let's jump right in with the first track from the album called A Message to You, Rudy.
Messing around. Better think of your future. Time is straighten right out. Creating problems in town. Rudy, a message to you, Rudy.
All right. Let's introduce our key players for this evening by way of a tweet-length review of this album. Let's start with you, Rob.
Hey, this is Rob here, and here's my tweet-length review of The Specials' debut record. I didn't know anything about ska going into this week, the origins or the various revival movements, and while I'm not going to buy any checkered shirts or pork pie hats anytime soon, I got to admit it's hard not to bob your head to this stuff.
Actually, if y'all could see the video, Rob actually looks like he's wearing like a black and white shirt, kind of rocking the two-tone thing that we'll talk about today. So, all right, let's kick it over to you, Adam.
Hey, everybody, this is Adam, and my quick tweet is Bob Marley too authentic for you? Are the Police too, well, good? Then have I got a treat for you. Enter The Specials and their stiff brand of punky and soulless reggae.
Oh, okay. All right, I'm digging this.
Coming in hot.
Yeah, I like it. This is Alan again here. So my tweet length review is, unlike the insidious punk-funk fusion that we've justifiably ragged on the show in the past, it actually turns out that punk and reggae together are much more palatable. So looks like we have a decent cross-section of opinions that we'll get in today. But let's start with The Specials themselves. Kind of who are they, where they come from. A little bit about this album first. So this album was released in October of 1979. It was one of really two albums that this band put out in this configuration. So we'll get into some of the band members shortly. But Adam, you'll kind of love this. You're all about the Gantt charts of the bands and how many members.
Oh, yeah.
It's... They've kept this thing going for a while in various permutations, but with the original configuration, they were really in and out of the music scene, I think, pretty quickly. Sort of that like better to burn out than fade away, although they kind of did both,
right,
as we'll talk about here today. But the Specials, as I mentioned earlier, were an English ska revival band. They actually formed in 1977, but really they were credited as the band that pioneered what came to be known as two-tone ska. and we're really leading the charge of what music historians kind of refer to as like the second wave of ska, with the first wave being the, you know, sort of traditional Jamaican ska of the 50s and 60s, and then the third wave being the ska that I think we probably are all, as like children of the 90s, very familiar with.
Sublime, I'm looking at you.
Real Big Fish.
Right.
Yeah, Boston's
right.
kind of like, even like Fishbone, no doubt, sort of dabbled in that space before they got big. And I will actually say I have a bit of an affinity for this kind of music. I know that it's pretty, you know, samey, as you know, we say sometimes. I really loved, you know, I loved that band Rancid. I loved the band Operation Ivy, who was a sort of precursor to Rancid. And so I will say I'm a little disappointed that in retrospect, those bands didn't do much with this sound other than, you know, kind of what the Specials were doing at the time.
Regurgitate it or just
not evolving
reimagine?
it really in my mind.
Right.
That's fun. I never made those connections with those bands. Not that I'm definitely not super familiar with those bands or really any of that punkier side of the 90s, let's say. But I just thought of them as precursors to pop punk. I wasn't making the connection with this kind of music. But now that you say that, it does make sense. And just on the whole, I'm sure we're going to get into general impressions, but this album was less samey than I was expecting it to be. And that was a pleasant surprise.
I agree with that. The musicianship was pretty high, and I think the production was really great too. And we should probably start out by saying that this album was actually produced by Elvis Costello. I don't know was he really producing much around this time? I know he was a fan of this band, but
I actually was wondering about that too. And I tried to look, well, first of all, I tried to get interviews of him reflecting on it. I couldn't really find anything. And then I did find a list of his production credits, and he has a production credit on a whole bunch of albums, but a lot of them are his albums, and no other sort of big names jump out to me other than this one. So I wouldn't say he's known as a producer. I got the impression he just liked this band and agreed to help him out.
Yeah, I think so too. And really the spirit of this band, and if you watch some of the videos, or especially if you hear some of the live music, like this was a live band, right? So the live shows that this band were putting on were intense. I mean, the songs were like twice the speed of what they are.
I was going to say, yeah, like I know most live performances, you always take up the tempo a hair. And the deluxe album, the deluxe version of this album that's available on Spotify, if you let it just run, you eventually start hitting some live stuff. And man, you're right. Like some of the live tunes feel like they're twice the speed. They are cooking.
These dudes worked hard. If you watch their shows, like it almost reminded me of like a P-Funk show on steroids. Like there's just guys running around the stage and
just faster,
just wiling out. And I mean, really, like if you've heard the term like skanking, which is sort of calling it dancing is maybe a little generous, but it's high energy. It's just moving all over the place, sweaty, and these guys were doing it in like full suits, right? So pork pie hats, just drenched in sweat. I mean, definitely working it. And I think that's what drew Elvis Costello to this band. And he actually did say about producing this album, he said, you know, my job was to get the band on tape before a more skilled producer got a hold of them and screwed it up completely by perfecting things that didn't need perfecting. So I think that was his sort of attitude going into this album.
This is a bit of speculation, but just to add to why Elvis Costello might have liked them, one aspect was they're from a similar part of the UK to Elvis Costello. He's from Liverpool. They're from a place outside Birmingham. I can't think of what it's called. Coventry, I want to say. Small town or something. But those are kind of in the same area. They're pretty far from London. They're the so-called Midlands, I believe, of UK. So just, I imagine there's some kinship there. The other part was probably the political message, the racial integration aspect of it, which I know he was a big proponent of and, you know, was pretty vocal about as well.
Rob, you know a lot more about Elvis Costello than I do. So there were a lot of quirky, I'll call them quirky elements on this album that I'm wondering if you saw some like do you think Costello was maybe behind some of that? Like the shouted vocals that are so out in front, you know, and just some of the other kind of, just quirky is the best word I could think of.
I was attributing some of that to him. I do think it's like impeccably well produced is how I would put it. The band sounds extremely tight, which of course is all credit to the band, I would imagine. But at the same time, there's so many textures, so many instruments going on.
Yeah.
When Alan goes on to read these members, right? There's a lot of people in this band. There's a lot going on in these songs amidst relatively simple rhythms. And I thought the production really was it's an example to me of a mix and a production that both feels like a live band, but feels so much more rich for listening to it in a recording because you can hear every detail. It had live energy, but it also had produced
Lots of texture. Yeah.
texture. Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I think they really captured, even though it was slowed down. Like I'm always skeptical of bands or groups that crush it live, but can't really translate that to their albums. And even though this was a lot more slowed down, I do think they kind of nailed that kind of the dance vibe that they're going for. And you mentioned it earlier, Rob. I don't know how you could listen to this and not bob your head and not dance and not want to get up and move, because it's very rhythmic music. And to kind of give you a sense for like where this all came from, Rob, you mentioned Coventry earlier. I think it's kind of important to talk about what was happening in Coventry at the time that this album was made and that this band kind of came to in existence. So this is like mid to late 70s. Coventry had actually been kind of destroyed like by Germany during World War II. That most of the city was basically leveled. And so as they were rebuilding the town, tons of people were moving in from Jamaica, from the West Indies. Manufacturing was actually really big. It's been said that Coventry was sort of like a mini Detroit in the sense that they actually had a pretty thriving automobile industry, but also much like Detroit, they ended up on pretty hard times. And this was really in the late 70s where there was a pretty bad recession. All the manufacturing jobs really disappeared. So you had all this sort of discontent, not just with the state of things, with the economy and politically, but you had a lot of racial tension as well. And so that was really where this music sort of came up. I should say the band was started by this guy, Jerry Dammers. He was this huge reggae fan who grew up in this era, and he in his high school years actually dabbled in playing some reggae and soul music, and was really getting into that sound of like the island rhythms and some of that old traditional ska. But what you also had going on at the time in parallel was the birth of the punk movement out there. So you had bands like The Clash who were starting to kind of come into their own around that time. And so he wanted to really like meld these two genres. And, like I said earlier, it actually works really well. And I think if this didn't exist and you said, hey, let's take reggae rhythms and ska and meld it with something that is pretty much utterly undanceable in standard punk rock, I don't think it would have really worked very well, but it did. Rob, you also touched on this earlier. Part of this whole deal was bringing like a multiracial aspect to things. They ultimately had 9 guys, and
Damn, that's a lot of mouths to feed.
And I mean, I guess you could field a baseball team with how many people they had playing. But they were a mixed race group where you had 3 black guys and do the math on the rest of the white guys, but it doesn't seem that edgy now to think of like, oh, like black guys and white guys playing together, what's the big deal? But like at that time where there was a lot of racial tension, there was a lot of like Nazism sort of bubbling under the surface, and there were skinheads who were coming to these shows and causing shit, who didn't want to see white and black people playing together. And I think that was part of their deal, is they were also trying to make a statement that, hey, like these are people we grew up with and we don't really see it this way. And that political kind of spirit and that punk spirit really like was imbued, I think, in their music.
You just hit on so many things that I learned this week. And one of them, I listened to this sight unseen on what the band looked like. And, the opening track, all I could think of was like, this is Fish and there's no soul and they're trying to do reggae and it's bad. And then a couple tracks in, you hear some voices and you're like, oh, wait, are there some actual islanders in this band? And I was like, okay. So then my view shifted a little bit more. And then as I dug into the evolution of reggae, I had no idea that ska predated reggae and that ska was a more, I won't call it straight lace, but I'll say it was more tight on the beats. And reggae is where, that came after that, is where you get that laid back, slower, that pocket, that groove. But in my mind, this was just a bunch of, not rhythmically challenged, but just, straight laced white guys trying to play reggae. And that's totally not what it was. So they are actually staying true to the roots of reggae, again, which I learned was this thing called ska in the 50s in Jamaica and those islands.
I didn't know that either. The fact that this movement itself was a revival. I was thinking of the 90s movement that we referenced, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, etc., and thinking that was a revival of this movement in Britain. Yeah, so that was news to me as well. I wanted to mention too, though, that Alan, you mentioned skinheads. I'm sure that nationalism, I'm sure what you said was holistically accurate, right? That nationalism and racial tension was a factor. But another thing I learned this week is that there was a separate skinhead movement. They called themselves skinheads, but it had nothing to do with white power in England. It was about this like working class,
anti-bourgeois thing.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so that can be easily confused. Just want to point that out because I think some of the members of this band considered themselves at some point a part of that movement.
Jerry Dahmer's the guy who started the band, at one point identified as a skinhead, also as a hippie at one point, and he renounced that pretty hardcore when he got into this music. But no, I'm glad you mentioned that, Rob, because I came across that as well. And specifically, I came across like an interview with somebody who was part of this whole like ska movement. And, he's talking about like the racial dynamics. And in the interview, he's like, yeah, then I realized like the black guys were cool and the white guys were cool and the skinheads were cool. And the way he just like threw it in there, I was like, wait, what the fuck?
Maybe it means something different to this guy, right?
Or I was like, man, they're just more accepting than I expected.
Right.
Well, it's confusing, and I didn't go on a deep dive here, right? It's confusing because it's possible that these movements played into each other, but Wikipedia draws a clear distinction between skinhead in UK and white power skinhead. And it says it's a member of a subculture that originated among working class youths in London in the 60s. And it included shaven heads, obviously, and like steel-toed boots and stuff that later was adopted by a lot of punks, frankly. But it doesn't mention racism, at least in the first two paragraphs. So I don't know.
I think it's a much different paradigm than like we're used to. And I was definitely guilty of like conflating some of it at various points of my research in this album. Something else you mentioned, though, Rob, was your impression that the third wave of ska was more of the revival. And I do agree to the extent that something that the groups like the Specials in the second wave really pioneered in this whole two-tone ska thing, which, by the way, two-tone was a record label that Jerry Dahmer started. But what it came to mean was the obvious parts of two-tone being, black and white. But if you look at all of their aesthetics, right?
That's so obvious. How did I miss that?
It is.
And then that's also the fashion, right?
Right. So that was the fashion. But they created some of that too, right? So the whole, wearing like your finest suits and that the pork pie hats and all that stuff, that was not, as far as I understand, original to like the first ska movement. That was kind of in response to like, a lot of the people that were playing this music were from like lower class, middle class. And the idea was, unlike the punks who really didn't give a fuck what they were wearing, these guys said, hey, we want to put on like the nicest stuff that we have. And we want to look good. And I think that is what kind of carried over into that third wave. So when you look at like the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and bands like that, I think they're paying homage to bands like the Specials with that attire.
Interesting. Just to be clear, though, I have to call you on. I think punks care a lot about what they dressed like. I think they were almost more image obsessed than any other subculture I could think of.
Well, yeah, you mean going to Hot Topic was not just a
carefully placed safety pins?
Yeah. So I'll rephrase that. I'll say that their aesthetic was meant to look like they didn't give a shit.
Right.
I think any group. I mean, shit. If you look at like, most hipsters are trying to look like they don't give a shit, but yeah, their hair is sort of like coiffed a certain way and all that. So point taken. I think the Specials, their legacy is really one of, it was a singular kind of moment in time that they captured, and they are seen as extremely influential. And well regarded. I think they had some critical acclaim. They weren't huge commercially though, right? This wasn't a band that sold like a ton of records. And to kind of illustrate some of that, let's get into by the numbers here. This album, the best really that it did was it was certified gold in the UK at about 100,000 records. I'm sure that after the fact, it's they've sold more and there's been various reissues and things like that. But from a commercial standpoint, like they were not like super commercially successful, although they were for a brief moment in time kind of like the band in the UK. So they had their moments. They definitely were not a one-hit wonder, but they were, they definitely came and went. So, certified gold, 100,000 records. Another number, the number one, right? So that's the number of songs on this album that actually topped the UK charts, which is a song called Too Much Too Young, which we'll actually talk about in a moment.
Really?
Somehow.
Okay. Yeah, all right. I'm surprised. Surprised.
Yeah, me too. I think that
9-minute jam. Never mind. All right, we'll get into the complaints in a minute.
So another number that I found surprising, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, the number 3, which was the number of years that this band was together in this configuration. In my mind, it was a lot longer, just because they've stuck around in different permutations. And then the final number I'll mention is the number 40, which again I alluded to earlier. If you look at the number of members who have been in this band, it's really like a ship of Theseus kind of thing, where it's just constituent parts at this point, and there's some thread back to the original group, but by and large it's mostly hired guns, I think, at this point.
Were they mostly the horn players swapping in and out? Because I've seen Snarky Puppy a handful of times, and I feel like they are one of those bands where they've got 6 horns on stage at any one point in time, and any one of those guys can change.
They're a collective by design, though.
Yeah, okay,
that's different.
I
think
that's
a different situation. I think you tell me. I didn't look at the Gantt chart, but is this a situation where Jerry Dahmer's, for instance, is the one through line because he owns the name and he just keeps cycling through people?
No, I think he actually was not one of the... I think he sort of disassociated with the band at a certain point. I don't have that information like in front of me right now. I think that one of the through lines was this guy Linville Golding, who was one of the black guitar players. He stuck around the entire time. There's been like 1 or 2 other members. They also had a hiatus at one point of a few years, but it's not a Iron Maiden type situation where you had like the one guy,
right,
and he's the hub,
and touring nonstop for 40 years, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. There's a couple different versions of this story. One is the Iron Maiden, the bass player. It's his band. It's kind of conceived as his band, and then he manages to keep it going as a going concern, cycling through various players. That's sort of what Axl Rose did with the Guns N' Roses name, because he owned the name, right? Much to the chagrin of his former bandmates. And then there's this, it sounds like what this is more like the Temptations. The Temptations are still touring the casinos of America, but all the original Temptations are definitely dead, right?
It's almost like the Harlem Globetrotters, or something. It's this like franchise that is still doing the same songs. But when they did start, though, they were, as I mentioned, like a pretty tight core of people. So the group consisted of course, Jerry Dammers, whatever you want to call it. So he was the founder, keyboard player. You had this guy Terry Hall, who was the primary lead vocalist, who he actually passed away in December of last year. So that may have hit the brakes on some of their recent touring. They also had Neville Staple on vocals, Linville Golding I mentioned earlier, this guy Roddy Radiation on guitars, Horace Panter on bass, John Bradbury on drums. And they later added, or at least added to the official lineup, Dick Cuthell and this guy Rico Rodriguez on horns, Rico Rodriguez was one of the original, not a pioneer, but he was OG ska. Like he was playing in like the 50s and 60s, bands.
Oh, wow.
And so it's probably a good segue to get into the song A Message to You, Rudy, where I believe he played on the original version of that song.
A message to you, Rudy. A message to you.
this. It sounds very old school. Listen, I think I said it at the top. I'm not familiar with this style of music, nor do I have any particular affinity to any of these waves we've mentioned. So it's pretty fresh listening for me. Other than Bob Marley, my main reggae touchstone is the Harder They Come soundtrack, which has a mix of Jimmy Cliff songs, Desmond Decker. So this kind of reminded me of the Desmond Decker material, which I think was happening in the 60s in Jamaica. I dug it, and I really like the mixing a lot. I think they did a really good job with the backing vocals, like where they're placed.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Although I think it's an interesting choice. We talked about the Black Crowes, that their number one tune was a cover, and to come out of the gate, opening track on your opening debut album is essentially a cover song, which is an interesting choice. But yeah, it's catchy as hell, man. That little horn motif has been running through my head all week, when I'm showering, when I'm waking up in the morning, and I'm not at all offended by it either. So I think it's a good song.
I've had a lot of these earworms in my head, but yeah, I think this one is the biggest one. It also occurred to me too that people might hear us or other musical nerds talk about 1-4-5 chord progressions. The so-called 1-4-5, you can learn a million songs with 1-4-5. In case you're wondering what that is, this is it.
This is a great example of CFG or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. I thought it was interesting, the two men singing in unison for the verse. I don't know if that's a classic, reggae or a ska thing, but it was a very interesting way to start it off, something I wasn't expecting. And to have the two guys singing in unison the verse, and then in the chorus they go to harmony, it was just a really cool way to start things off. So right out of the gate, this did prepare me, I think, for actually, now that I think about it, I think the album is much different than this very old school classic song. So maybe this isn't a great.
I would agree. This stands out as distinct from most of the rest of the material.
Yeah, right. So yeah, this doesn't necessarily represent the rest of the album.
Well, and there's also like an additional fake out if you are listening to this on like a streaming platform, where the most accessible version is this deluxe version, which they actually start off the album with a song called Gangster, which was not on this album originally. Apparently it was included in some of the US versions of the album at the time, but it wasn't even the first song. It was like sandwiched in between a few other songs. So not sure why they sort of let off with it in the deluxe version, although it was their first single that they put out as a band. And it was a pretty good song too. We can kind of drop a little clip in here.
Yeah, I listened on Spotify, of course. I think we all did. And I just looked at the specials catalog and saw that the deluxe version was the only one. And it's a double disc where the second disc is all live. So usually when I see that comes up a lot with some of these old records. They've been remastered and re-released as deluxe versions with either demos or live recordings kind of in the back half. And I usually just don't even research it. I just listen to disc one and assume that is the record. So that's confusing. But Ari, this ended up being my favorite song. I think it still sounds pretty hip. The really dry drum sound, which you kind of hear across the whole record, combined or contrasted really nicely with his really wet, echoey lead vocal, to me is just really, really tasty. And I would just say throughout this song, I don't have specific timestamp examples. There's a lot of little, what you might call background answer riffs. There's an idea in music of question and answer. One instrument plays a question, and then another instrument kind of answers it with a riff. There's a lot of subtlety and texture and answer riffs from guitar, from organ, just really cool, tasty little spots that only just pop up for a second and then go away.
Yeah, and especially in this genre, there was a little riff in there that I would almost call Egyptian. In the mode it was playing, and it was just like out of left field, but it worked really well. Yeah, so I thought that in a song that was under 3 minutes, they packed in a lot of cool different feel changes and like you said, just different like little motifs that are popping in and out throughout the song that make it really interesting.
Absolutely. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to mention is at first I was asking myself, is that a shaker, like some kind of percussive element, or is that a guy's voice? But then I watched the tape. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
But then I watched the tape of them doing it on SNL, and it's the second singer doing it like a beatbox.
Oh, that's cool. That's very cool. This one immediately, although Alan, you were saying this wasn't on the original release?
It wasn't on the original UK release. It was on some versions of the US release, but it was not the lead off track. It was kind of buried in the mix somewhere.
Because this has Costello written all over it in terms of the theme of, you know, the corrupt government, the police are corrupt, the brute squad's going to come and get you. That's I got that feel. Again, what very little I know about Elvis Costello, this song stuck out to me like, oh, I think I can see, not that he wrote it or influenced it, but why he might dig this band.
Goon Squad. Yeah, I totally hear that.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Squad.
Well, what's funny is apparently part of this, there's a line about something like confiscating our guitars or something like that. There's actually a back.
Yes.
Did you read about the backstory behind that at all?
No.
So I think they were staying at a hotel, possibly in France, but I'm not sure. And there was a band that stayed there before them called The Damned. And I guess they destroyed the place so badly that there was like a guilt by association, so that they preemptively, like the hotel staff took their guitars as like collateral for a potential thrashing of the hotel room.
We know your type. We know your type.
But as a song, this song slaps, man. Like it's killer. I love when it comes back into the head after a little bit of the jamming. Like it just relieves so nicely. The only thing I didn't like about this song, and it's true for some of the songs on here, I'm not a fan of the monotone. So this guy Terry Hall, who was the singer, just more of the
I can get it. Oh, okay. Right.
And I feel like it's what I don't like about like bands like The Clash either, or like it's a little bit of like Sex Pistols vibe. It's a minor complaint, but that's what we do here. So left a little
Get out the nitpicking comb. Go through.
That didn't bother me. Yeah, it did remind me of The Clash, or that felt like a major punk element. And we haven't mentioned yet too, you know, what parts of it are punk and what parts of it are ska, because I in other words, I think the vocal is a big part of what makes it punk. Maybe it's also the lyrical content, but musically, when I think of punk, I'm thinking of almost all downstrokes, boom, 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 and this is the sort of the inverse of that. It's all about the upstroke. Reggae is all about hitting on the 2 and the 4 beat, right?
Right.
So you hear that throughout the entire record. It's like a rule of songwriting for these guys.
It's definitely like a template almost. I think that sort of shows up in a lot of these songs. I think where the punkness comes from is the tempo, the energy, the message, the political message, the sort of like confrontational, antagonistic, you know, piece of it, where if you go back and listen to some of, you know, 50s and 60s Jamaican ska or, you know, reggae from that era, it's a lot more, you know, some of it's more down tempo, it's more sort of dubby, and, you know, something like you kind of want to like smoke a joint and just kind of zone out to it, where this is more.
This is not that. Yeah, right. There's nothing relaxing about this.
Although, you know, my sources tell me that it's still a fun ride if you want to do that.
Right.
But the anonymous sources don't want to be named here. Cool. All right, so let us move on to the next track on our list, which is the aforementioned track, Too Much, Too Young.
You've done too much, much too young. Now you're married with a kid when you could be having fun with me. Oh no, don't do it, no more picnic. You've done too much, much too young. Now you're married with a son when you should be having fun with me. Oh, we don't want no more picnic.
I'm not 100% sure. Did they literally just loop the song? Like, did they write a 3-minute song and then start it over? I swear, around the 6-minute mark, when he's just harping on that "too much, too young," it just felt very, very labored. And this was the hit, which is crazy to me because this was one of my least favorite songs on the album.
Mind-boggling. I wrote that it was the low point for
Okay,
two
yeah.
reasons. One, it's way too long, and everything else on this record is so tight in terms of format. You have 3 minutes and change. Some are 2 minutes and change, most of the songs. This is by far the longest song, and yet it does not have material to sustain it. There's like 2 melodies and 2 lyrics.
That's it.
And
They
on
just
top of
keep
that, it's
saying-
preachy. It's like, what is this message? We got it. Okay.
Right. Well, and this song kind of reminded me like lyrically of, well, let me first say, I did find this to be catchy. Like this is one of the ones that's sort of ringing in my head still. So I can kind of see its appeal in that way. But I thought lyrically it reminded me almost, and I don't mean this to be like crass, but it just had that feel of like a modern country song where it's just like you're watching TV, you shouldn't have had a baby. Like there's not much metaphor, or it's just here you go.
The little fun lyric of "too much, too young." I feel like they found that and they were like, "Oh, this is a song, right?" And Tom's talked about it. We've all talked about it, where you have like a really good lyrical phrase and then you try to write a song around it. This is one of those instances where it didn't work very well. And also, Alan, to your point, I didn't understand because it sounds like they're promoting using birth control, right? Because I don't want to have a baby and you could have had fun with me. But then they say something about like, not genocide, but the implication that the government wants to sterilize. I think that's the word they use, that the government's going to sterilize us. So it was a very odd, conflicting lyrics that didn't quite tell a story for me.
Yeah. In addition to that, he's basically saying, if you didn't have that kid, you could come out and get drunk with me and possibly hook up. Like, what kind of message is that?
I agree that this was the one where it was like, I'm missing this isn't like Rage Against the Machine talking about like dismantling the patriarchy and all that. This was just like, and it turns out that Jerry Dahmers, who wrote this song, later did say that he was just sort of jealous that, a love interest of his had maybe moved on and whatever. But like,
apparently it was controversial as well. I read that at the time in England, it was kind of a big deal that this was a radio hit because they were talking about, I think he says at the end, wear a cap, like a condom, and birth control and all this stuff that I guess in 76, 77 was still pretty taboo for, mainstream radio.
Well, apparently when this song was featured in like a promo video on Top of the Pops, which I think they may have actually performed this on there as well, but they actually cut the song off right before that last line of "try wearing a cap." So yeah, I think it was
Right.
kind of heavy. Yeah, I don't know what's up with it does feel like they just stacked the same song together like twice in a row. Like I definitely felt faked out at a point where I was like, are they just restarting the song? Like there's really no reason for it.
Yeah, it's one of these examples. I know we always complain about songs being too long, but in this case, I think if they just cut it in half, I would have found it much more palatable. It would have glanced off me.
What was Elvis Costello thinking, man? He knows better than this. Maybe they overrode him. They got one veto and this was it.
Well, funny, I think Costello was really trying to just like get out of the way and like let them do their thing. I think he wasn't like terribly interested in kind of meddling or whatever. In fact, I think there's a story where he actually wanted them to kick out one of the guitar players during the recordings, but Dahmers was like, nah, I don't want to do that. And so, yeah, that might have been where he sort of pressed his luck and decided to retreat back into the corner. All right. So let's move on to the next song on our focus list. It's called Concrete Jungle.
Everyone wants to hurt me.
Yeah, I dig this song. I would probably call it my second favorite song. I feel like it's definitely a success. The claps are cool. The little drum breakdowns have cool energy to them. But I do have a complaint, which is Bob Marley has a song already of the same name. Is that like a
Right.
trope? Because I saw in an article that the Specials also later released a song called Rat Race, which is also a Bob Marley song. But they're not connected song wise, other than by the title. So is that a thing in this subculture? That just seems bizarre to me.
I read it as more of an homage because I think the Concrete Jungle by Marley is talking about how terrible his town is,
Sure.
right? Back in Kingston, I believe. And this is the same thing where these guys are downtrodden. They hate their city because it's, everybody's poor or the jobs or whatever. So maybe this was their deliberately saying, hey, we're going through the same thing that Bob was going through, right?
I get it.
It's a little-
It's a
a
phrase.
yeah,
it's out
right.
there. Concrete Jungle. It's a good turn of phrase. I'm not sure when it was coined.
Sure.
I don't think Bob Marley coined it or anything, right? But it just feels like they could have given it a different title and had the exact same song, kind of eluded this problem.
Yeah. Right. They went kind of head on at that.
Yeah, it feels like they wrote it. Maybe they had like a melody in mind, and then at the end they were like, "Shit, we need a name. How about Concrete Jungle?" It is. Maybe it's part of the subculture. I'm not entirely sure, but it does leave a bad taste in my mouth. I definitely agree with that. Musically, though, I think it's pretty slick. I love the little like bass double stops like that.
Yes. That
Feels very
that's super
un-reggae
cool.
to me. Like it feels a lot more progressive than
Punk. Yeah, this is where I got a lot of punk vibes.
No, musically, it's very strong. It's totally a successful song. I would play it. I would definitely play it again.
Yeah. I do feel like I couldn't put my finger on where I've heard the beat before, but it does feel like a very common, like a dun, 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 dun. That feels a little bit like a played out kind of beat just in music in general. But
Wait, is that what it is? That's the Bo Diddley beat, what you just did with your mouth.
let me spin this back here real quick.
This has more disco vibes, actually.
I think
was
this beat
very
is a
sped
little
up
different
disco.
than the traditional Bo Diddley that you did.
You know what? No, so what it does is a da 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 da. I think I was conflating this too.
SATURDAY.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that, or "Hey Mickey, you're so fine." Or something.
Yes.
Right.
I think that's what I was anchoring to. So yeah, thanks for that.
So I know I came hot at the top of the episode, but truth be told, I do like this album. One issue, and I guess my biggest complaint about the whole thing, and maybe it's just the genre idea that we're a ska band, we're going to write a ska album, so that every song is ultimately going to wind up with a heavy syncopation. Like it always has to wind up in that spot, because this song and the next two songs on the focus list, they start out so different, so cool. And by the time I got to these, I kept in my head thinking, okay, well, in 3 seconds, it's going to go back to cha, cha, cha. And I just wanted them to just deviate from the pattern just a little bit, but they always went back to the cha, cha syncopation. Again, I get it, they're in a genre, but that was the one thing that rubbed me a little about this entire experience with this album, was just waiting for the syncopation to come back. And it always did.
Yeah, I agree. Again, it has a little bit of that like templated kind of feel to it. And yeah, I think it's just like a hallmark of this music in general. But you hear it in a lot of these modern ska bands too. Like I wouldn't call Rancid necessarily like ska, but they were very ska influenced. Like if you listen to that song, Time Bomb, it's
Oh my God, that came up in my head. So black shirt, white cat, Cadillac, or whatever the hell it was.
it's
right?
like slathered in these kind of rhythms.
Right.
Yeah. It does take some of the mystique out of it if your expectations are a certain way that you're what you're gonna hear. It does kind of like demystify it in a weird way, but I guess it's just what they do.
I mean, what I'm suggesting is that Elvis Costello said, guys, we should slow it down for one song and do a ballad. Let's cover After the Love Is Gone by Earth, Wind, and Fire. And no syncopation. No syncopation.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you said that Elvis was kind of hands off, which I could totally believe, because like I said, it does have live energy, and you can tell the band is tight sort of before they walked in. But then I guess I have to say it's impeccably recorded. There's really great isolation, and then it's impeccably mixed. So, to me, that's what stands out across a lot of other records I think we hear. You can really hear everything amidst a relatively crowded arrangement. You can hear what they're intending you to hear, and different instruments kind of get their moments throughout in a really pleasant way.
I agree.
Just feels like you don't get that on every record. That's uncommon, I would say.
Yeah, I think that it sounds really good, and I also think even the arrangements too, where when you have this much instrumentation, it's really easy to have just mud and everyone's kind of throwing their shit against the wall and everyone's trying to get their licks in. When it's time for the bass to shine, it really comes through and everything feels like it. I think the arrangement's good. I think the mixing's good. It's all pretty well on point.
Alan, I did want to get your thoughts on bass tone in this song because it felt a little too clean, and my God, am I nitpicking here? It felt like it was straight direct. Like there's no amp sound. There's no, I don't want to call it dirt, but it doesn't feel like there's a lot of warmth around it. It feels like it's just run straight into the box. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that or if it rubbed you the wrong way or if you were in love with it.
I didn't really put much thought into the tone or like how things were mic'd. I wonder if the double stops and some of the higher like mid frequencies are just so underutilized in this kind of music where it's so dubby and it's generally so like bassy that maybe it just had a little bit more attack in the bass tone.
Right. I'm not used to hearing those register of notes in this type of music, so maybe it just sounded...
Well, and it's possible, don't discount that there may have been a pick involved.
Oh, hang on.
Hold on.
Get your drinks ready.
I can't confirm or deny, but picks may have been utilized.
I like the idea of the drinking game that we need to continue after the 100th episode.
I mean, Tom's not here to defend himself, so let's really get into this.
Tom's position is completely ridiculous. Obviously, a pick is the right choice in many occasions.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that he'll never budge from that is very endearing and very Tom.
Charming.
All right. Let's move on to our next song in the mix, which is a song called Blank Expression.
Snow is falling all around. 7 o'clock and the roads are blocked. So I walk downtown. There's no one around. I walk in a bar and immediately I sense danger. You look at me, girl, as if I was some kind of a total stranger. Where did you get that blank expression on your face?
This was the ballad I was talking about. This is the one I wanted. This is actually my favorite track on the album. Yeah, I love this tune. The intro I thought was outstanding. And they managed to come back to a very, right, that intro, there's nothing ska, there's nothing reggae about it. And they somehow managed to come back to that and somehow introduce the ska rhythm into it in a way that doesn't annoy the shit out of me. So I loved this tune.
This was a low point for me, which I feel like we've had a lot of these moments, which is good. I think having that diversity of opinion is great. I could not get past the fact it sounded like a fucking Christmas song. Like, listen to the beginning and tell me that does not sound like it's launching into a Christmas song.
I don't want a lot for Christmas. Yes, you're right. Okay, now that you say
That's remarkably accurate. Yeah.
All right, you destroyed my favorite part of the album.
That's just really the beginning part. That's not what I didn't like about the song. The blank expression, like it just didn't feel very like musical to me in like the vocal delivery, and it was again one of those examples of the sort of clashy, Sex Pistol-y kind of and I know I'm being a little bit kind of nitpicky here on this, but it just frankly I felt like the song title captured my exact mode when I was listening to this song.
That's what I said too. No, listen, commenters, you say we're always the same. How dare you? we have three
Right,
distinct opinions here because I said Blank Expression. To me, it was a total meh song. It was fine. I did think that the vocal trade-off that Alan just alluded to stood out as disconcerting and like a bad production choice. Something was weird about it. I don't know if it was the mix or the delivery or the arrangement itself. There was that hard pan drums thing. Just so you have to take another drink. We just mentioned hard panning.
Right.
But this song didn't really do anything for me. I thought of it as kind of a sister song to It Doesn't Make It All Right, which I actually kind of liked more. The other sort of ballad on the record. We didn't put it on the focus list, but yeah, I felt neutral about it.
Oh, yes, I know which one you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It just didn't do it for me. I also felt like this was one of the tunes where, and maybe I should have been like keyed into more of this to see how consistent it was, but this also didn't strike me as like, hey, we're trying to make a statement, or I heard a quote from somebody who was involved in this era, not in this band but another ska band, that was like, if you're not saying anything in your music, then you're nothing. Like what's the point of even doing it? And I just felt like this kind of veered into that territory a little bit. Yeah, didn't quite do it for me. All right, well, moving on to our last song. Well, is there anything else that we got on this?
Oh, God, I'm scared.
No.
No.
All right.
What's the last song called again?
Oh, the last song on our focus list is a song called Little Bitch.
1, 2. If you ever hear us now in the night, your body starts to sweat, it shakes your shivers in front. You know it's different, your mother, she hates your guts. She knows that you love her, so she holds you tight all through the night until the broad daylight. But when she doesn't come home, you have to sleep alone. Then you wedge your bed, and I think that...
Hey, Alan, I think you made a mistake. You played Jumpin' Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones.
Right? That song existed in the timeline, right? When this song was that.
Not only existed, it's one of the most popular songs of the last decade.
I know. That's what I thought. I was like, did it come out yet? Yeah.
It was very jarring. I didn't connect it to that song specifically, but I did write a note that I thought it sounded like a Rolling Stones or like a early Aerosmith, kind of song. I was thinking like Mama Can or something like that. But I liked parts of this song. I think lyrically, it's again, it's a little flimsy, I guess would be a nice word for it.
But those backups in the second verse are really cool. They're like super high. I don't know if they're saying a word or just saying ooh or something, but it's really cool over top.
It's insane. 1, 2. And your girlfriend swing lips at 17. She's got a left hand and a black jeans. You know what that means? She's just a little pretty. She shares your...
I noticed those two, but I really couldn't get past the theft of the Jumpin' Jack Flash riff. I think it is literally, for at least 6/8 of this, is exactly the same riff.
Yeah, I'm listening now. Yeah, it's damn close.
Yeah.
How is that not a lawsuit? How didn't the Rolling Stones sue, what was that other 90s band, Bittersweet Symphony? And they won that suit.
The Verve
The
pipe?
Verve?
The Verve.
Or was the
No, it was just the
Verve?
Verve. Just the Verve, I believe. And they won that suit for the violin line from one of their songs. I mean, come on.
Wow.
Mick. Wake up, buddy.
Yeah, he could be getting some money. Well, this was another one where the intro, regardless of whether or not it's stolen, it was really nice. It was different. It kind of took me out of the syncopation. And then, yeah, 6 seconds in, here we go. Come on.
That was the other thing, is that this one reminded me the most of the 90s wave of this music, which I don't like, or which I don't have a good feeling about.
Yeah. When I referenced that song Time Bomb earlier, the Rancid song, the do 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 do, like just the whole walking bass line thing, which I do like, but I do feel like it really foreshadowed that era in a big way. Going back to the Stones thing though, what's really interesting is Mick Jagger was actually a fan of this band and tried to sign them to Rolling Stone Records. And what happened is they ended up wanting to do their own thing, which is where, Dahmer's actually started a record label called Two Tone. And that's sort of like where this all kind of got its name from. Yeah.
Can you imagine that, by the way? Can you imagine your band
Turning down.
has not recorded anything yet, and Mick Jagger offers to put you on his label?
You say, no, I'm good.
Nah, pass.
We want to be around for 3 years and then take a 15-year hiatus and then come back with our
I want to
third
handle my own distribution. That always goes amazing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that it would have prevented what really brought this band down, which was just like a lot of personalities that didn't agree. There's not a huge history of like, I'll be honest, I was a little disappointed that there wasn't as much like debauchery or shenanigans as I generally like to see from a band out of this era.
Like this, yeah.
But they definitely, a lot of alcoholics, a lot of, I think what
All
actually,
right, well, then that's good.
yeah, we check that box.
Let's go with the classics.
I do think what ultimately broke them was when they came to America and just couldn't handle the rigors of touring and all that stuff. Yeah, so they might have been doomed kind of from the start. All right, well, I think that gives us a nice representative sample of the Specials' debut album. I think the only thing left for us to do is to vote on whether or not this is a must-listen album. Let's start with you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. For me, it's going to be a yes. Pretty easy pass. I know we nitpicked it a little bit, but overall, I think it was a really excellently made product of a record. The band's tight. It comes through, as does the live energy. It was fun to listen to. This is definitely not my type of music. It wasn't before, and it will not in the future, but I wouldn't mind putting this on again. And if you do, when you do listen to it, as I'm recommending, don't sleep on Gangster. I thought that was a really good track, and it's unfortunate it's in this streaming Spotify version, but maybe not on all the versions. So yeah, I think it was totally worth hearing. It is worth hearing before you die.
All right. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I read something somewhere in some review that said that the Specials are important because when they came out, it was as if Depression-era Dust Bowl ballads suddenly became hip again in an era of global economic meltdown.
Wow.
And for that to occur, it's definitely a feather in their cap, so I appreciate that. But again, I'm not a huge on this genre, just like Rob. I guess this is second wave, whatever it is. But it was quirky, but it's solid. It kept me interested in a genre that generally I get bored with. And I learned a lot this week in terms of the history of reggae and syncopation, and I read some stuff about the drum beats, the one drop style of drumming that's in reggae. So this was a great week, a great album. You should listen to it. It's a yes from me.
All right. Well, I guess that renders my vote irrelevant, but I'm going to vote yes anyway. So we'll give the Specials a clean sweep here.
Nice.
Yeah, it checks a lot of boxes for me. I think it's historically significant. It really pioneered a sound that still, as much as it's maybe like a niche kind of sound, that is still around and that still has influenced a lot of bands. And I think it also, as we go through these albums and we really dissect, sometimes I can appreciate the bands where, I don't really even want to put that much thought into it. And I just want to like listen and kind of enjoy the music. And I think it's easy listening. It's cool. It's danceable. I think some of it's not the most, it's a little samey at times, but yeah, definitely I think it's a must listen for sure.
As someone who doesn't like the genre, if you're that person, it's better than you think it's going to be, for sure.
Yes. Well said, Rob. Absolutely. Because, yeah, going into it, I think somebody had said when we announced this, like, oh, I think they're ska. And I rolled my eyes like, oh, God. And then
we all know that feeling.
Yeah, my memory of ska bands was in high school. I think, well, Phil and Tom aren't on the call, but I feel like we all went to a ska show somewhere in Wilmington, and the lead singer, for some reason, just started throwing soda cans into the crowd and, like, injuring people. So that was my takeaway from ska music. But this is not that, so listen.
Yeah, catchy tunes. And, sorry, looking back over my notes, I realized there was one little factoid. I was clicking around on Wikipedia, and the lead singer on this record, Terry Hall, apparently dated one of the Go-Go's and is credited as co-writing Our Lips Are Sealed, which is one of their biggest hits.
Really?
Wow.
Which is a great tune.
Interesting. I didn't know he did any writing of any sort. He seemed like a singer and not much more in my mind. But hey,
What's that supposed to mean? Bass player? No.
Ooh. Hey, it's sad because it's true. All right. Well, specials, you're in the books. Nicely done, folks. Now let's see what we got in the old mailbag. Rob, I'm told you are in possession. What do you got for us today?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Alan. Yeah, I've been carefully collating all the Pixies feedback. It was a contentious episode, and lots of people wrote in. And so I'm going to read you a few of the choice words that came back from our... Well, I think we slammed... I wasn't on the call, so you can blame Alan, Adam, and Tom.
I knew the reckoning was coming.
Really, you can blame Tom. His address is... No.
Right.
But we ultimately did vote it on, I should point out, for the listeners. But anyway, here's a lot of people wrote in about it, so here's a couple samples. Brian from the UK writes, "Guys, I'm currently listening to this review, and wow, certainly didn't see that coming. You've been slamming most of my favorites. Not quite sure why. I saw Pixies on their UK tour back in 1998. They were incredible. They were the future of rock and roll, wearing a flannelette shirt." And then he sent us a Pixies YouTube clip to attempt to convince us further. Unfortunately, we had already recorded the episode. We cannot be convinced, Brian.
Wait, does he not realize that like we take a position and we dig our heels in despite any incoming evidence?
I think people get it. I think people get it. But they have to make their voice heard, and we appreciate it.
Yeah.
We love when you write in. Bill from Virginia says he wrote some nice things about us in general, and then he said, "I also wanted to tell you that Pixies Surfer Rosa has the best drum sound of their catalog. It also has boobs on the cover, as you guys pointed out, the best single of their entire catalog. But honestly, for me, it's probably not a must listen. I'd rate their other records on par or slightly better."
Wow. All right.
Interesting. Yeah, I do think they became a lot poppier as their albums went on. I think they became maybe a little bit more accessible. But yeah, that's cool.
Okay, and I want to read one last one. Chris from California writes, "This is why I listen to the pod. In spite of your incorrect opinions, you found yourselves to the correct result. Surfer Rosa should be listened to before you die. I'm a little older than you blokes, and unabashedly an indie rock and metal kid from that era. Pixies had a sound that was unlike anything I had heard previously. Of course, the surf and garage rock elements were present, but the application of the pop form with dissonance and harmony touched me in all the special places. Side note, you've changed my mind on Beck."
Oh,
Wow.
So the rare positive mind change that we put out into the world, I want to point out. We've ruined plenty of artists for our listeners. But Beck, I believe we gave a pretty relatively glowing review to Odelay, and Chris is saying we changed his mind on Beck. So
Wow.
good on us.
All right.
hey,
Nice work.
doing the Lord's work out here. Cool. Well, we'll take it. Hey, that's a great cross section. I feel like, as long as look, I never want to come on here and just sort of toe the popular line, or I think these albums, it's worth kind of digging in and really dissecting, like, are they as great as people claim they are? And so, yeah, we welcome any and all feedback. Please keep it coming. Our email address is 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com. Definitely let us know what you think.
Yes, I totally agreed. We have tons of respect for the craft, but it's fun to take hard opinions. And, I don't think we've mentioned this in a while, but I think the underlying premise of the show is that there aren't actually 1001 things you need to listen to in this world. And that, I think that's a reasonable position to take overall.
Yeah, aren't we? I think what's our acceptance rate? Like 60% ish?
Yeah, we're in the 60 to 65% range last I checked.
So in 15 years, we'll be able to tell you there's like 600 albums.
600, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And all the ones that he left off, which is going to be a whole separate thing. But
Right.
nonetheless, speaking of albums that you must listen to, we need to figure out what we are going to listen to next week. So, Rob, let us know what that Albinator is cooking up.
Yeah, it's in my possession now. I've cranked it up. I was looking around on the back and I found a little switch. It was set to Rude Boy, so I'm going to turn that off. And without further ado, give it a spin. Next week, we shall be listening to REM's Green.
Okay.
All right.
Big band, long-standing
Yeah.
concern, college rock heroes. So excited. I don't know the record specifically, but I'm under the impression all their records have at least one song I know on them.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, because I think this predates like their MTV explosion with like Losing My Religion and whatnot. So I'm kind of curious to dig into that, because I really don't know that side of REM. So that should be a fun time.
Awesome.
Same.
Cool. All right. Well, we have our homework assignment, and we really hope that you'll join us next week to dive into REM. With that, I've been Alan.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Adam.
Boosh, 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 boosh.